I think there's a lot of shame and isolation that comes with the experience of being a survivor or victim of domestic violence. And just simply helping to break that isolation, I think makes a big difference.
Get out, because they don't change. They do not change. The average adult that has those type of tendencies, they're going to continue to have them. They just don't change. Get out and seek some help. There's a brighter future.
What I always remind people of is that victims don't get into relationships because they wanted to be abused. They got into relationships because they thought they were loved and they loved. People don't get into this because they want to be abused. They get into it because they have hope and they have love, and they remain sometimes because they still have hope.
You're listening to Amplify America, where we highlight social issues, the people affected by them, and the people working to find solutions to our nation's most persistent problems. I'm your host, April Yvonne Garrett. On this episode, I explore domestic and intimate partner abuse in Colorado. According to the National Network Against Domestic Violence is a pattern of coercive, controlling behavior that can include physical abuse, emotional and psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and financial abuse. Signs that you or someone you know is being abused include their partner showing extreme jealousy, their partner isolates them from family and friends, their partner has complete control over their finances and makes all important life decisions, their partner threatens to harm them or their family, or their partner destroys their belongings. Signs that you or someone you know is abusive include you thinking of yourself as being in charge in your relationship, you feeling that your way is the only correct way to do things, you have hit, kicked, slapped, or pushed your partner, others tell you you seem paranoid, or your partner seems afraid. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 7 women and 1 in 25 men have been injured by an intimate partner. Only 34% of people who are injured by an intimate partner receive medical care for their injuries. Domestic violence is associated with higher rates of depression and suicidal behavior. In this episode, we examine domestic and intimate partner abuse with a survivor who became a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist, a survivor who became a national authority and advocate, and a program director for a full-service domestic violence center in Colorado. Rose Andom is a successful Denver entrepreneur, former McDonald's franchise owner, philanthropist, and domestic violence survivor. As a child in Oklahoma, Rose witnessed domestic violence perpetrated by her father against her mother. The increasingly aggressive assaults led her mother to move with her children to live with relatives. Rose's mother supported her family with various jobs, and her focus was unrelentingly on the importance of education. Despite the disadvantages she faced, Rose became the first in her family to attend college, earning a BA and an MBA. In 1981, Rose began working with the McDonald's Corporation, where she had a long and successful career. In 1992, she purchased her first franchise in Kansas City and eventually landed in Denver after buying all 3 of the McDonald's franchises at the Denver International Airport, where under her leadership, sales tripled. Rose has been an active member of many leadership groups, including serving as vice chair of the National Black McDonald's Operators Association. She has employed hundreds of people at her restaurants. In 2016, her lead gift of $1 million endowed the Rose Andom Center, Colorado's first family justice center. This collaboration between community-based organizations and city government agencies is a centralized collaborative facility where domestic violence victims can access comprehensive services in their journey to find safety from abuse.
My name is Rose Andom. I'm an entrepreneur, philanthropist.
We have come to know you as a successful Denver businesswoman, entrepreneur, philanthropist, and we also now know about your history as a domestic violence survivor. But let's go back a little bit in your life before this moment. Where did you grow up and what was your childhood like?
I was born in McAlester, Oklahoma. You probably never heard of it, but I really grew up in Kansas City, Kansas. My mother was married to a man, our father, who was abusive. At the age of 8, we moved to Kansas City to get away from him. They were actually divorced at the time. I'll tell you an interesting story. In the middle of the night, one of my mother's brothers and a brother-in-law, they had driven down from Kansas City. We threw whatever we could into the trunk of the car, and my mother, myself, and my 2 brothers got in the car with my uncles, and off we went to Kansas City, never to return.
So that was your first recollection of domestic violence. You saw that in the home as you were growing up. What kind of impact did that have on you?
My primary recollection of domestic violence was finding my father with a gun to my mother's head, threatening to shoot her. And myself, my 2 brothers, begging and crying, please don't do that. Please don't do that.
And how old were you, if you can recall?
Around 6, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, fortunately, he didn't.
Yes.
But that memory, I will always have it. I will always have it. I've always considered that I've made pretty good business decisions. I can't say that about my personal life. I think I've made several mistakes. I married a guy in Kansas City. He turned out to be abusive. Yeah, and did I see some signs before we got married? Yeah, but I thought, he'll change when we get married.
Can you tell me what some of the signs were?
He was very possessive.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't really like for me to go visit my friends, things of that nature. At that time, I had, fairly long hair, and he thought that it attracted too much attention. I had a little sports car, and he thought that attracted too much attention. In an attempt to try to prove to him that I really did love him and that I wasn't interested in anyone else, I sold the car. I cut my hair, but he got worse, quite honestly. Because I was traveling a lot, when I got home, I may be gone like 3 days out of the week. And when I got home, he was just full of all kinds of questions and accusations of who I might have been with when I was, on the road. Although he did strike me once across the face, it was primarily emotional. And it got so bad that when I was traveling home and I knew that he was going to be there, I'd start to get pains in my neck and my shoulder, all over. And I went to a doctor, and ultimately he said, I don't find anything wrong with you. He said, so what's going on at home? So it was, it was the stress and the anxiety that was causing physical pain. I'd left him 2 times while we were still in Kansas City, but I went back, which is so typical of women in abusive relationships. They beg and they say, oh, honey, I'll never do it again. And guess what they do? So he got a job in Los Angeles with IBM. The guy was brilliant when it came to computers. He read manuals for relaxation, but he had no people skills, didn't have any friends. And looking back on it, I wish I had been a little bit more astute and really, examining the kind of person he was. But I moved to Los Angeles with him, quit my job with Ford. When we were there, he didn't want me to work, which is another sign of the possessiveness. And, it's just you and me. You don't need anybody else. So I didn't have a job, which meant I didn't have any money. He controlled all of the money. One day, he grabs me by the throat and he says, I ought to just go ahead and kill you right now. I said, okay. The next morning, We went to bed. I didn't sleep a wink. And as soon as he left for work, I got up. I threw some clothes, essentials in my little car. I had a little, what was that thing? It was a little Ford Escort, I think it was called. I don't even think they make them anymore. And I ran.
Where did you run to?
I stayed in LA. My plan when I left there was to go back to Kansas City. I had a really good cousin. Basically grew up with him and his sister in Kansas City. And we were always very close. He was in the entertainment business. I ran to his apartment, and he was married at the time. He had never liked Michael to begin with, for obvious reasons. They let me sleep on their sofa. I told him, I said, well, I need to move back to Kansas City. And he said to me, he said, why? He said, you are smart, you're educated. I think there's more opportunities here than there are in Kansas City, and you ought to just stay. So I did. I think that was good advice, because I really didn't want to go back to Kansas City. So I slept on his sofa until I could find a job. One day, I don't even remember where I was, but I met a guy that my cousin knew, and I was just chatting with him and telling him, well, I need to find a job. And he said to me, have you ever thought about McDonald's? And I looked at him and I said, not really. I have an MBA. And he said, there are so many opportunities with McDonald's that people just have no idea about. It's not just about flipping burgers. He happened to know the regional manager for Los Angeles, and his name was Reggie Webb. He was also African-American. So I went in and I interviewed probably 4 or 5 different people, and they hired me on in a fast track management development program. It was a program designed to get you up into middle management on a fairly short period of time. So that was my introduction to McDonald's. I literally started working in a restaurant as an assistant manager, and I had to learn every position in there.
How old were you when you started this trajectory?
I was 31. Yeah, I started to work for McDonald's in 1981.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, it was quite difficult for a while, or for a long while, quite honestly, because I wasn't used to being on my feet, running around in a McDonald's all day long. I became accustomed to it, and I was an assistant manager, and I was promoted to a general manager of a restaurant in Santa Monica. I was there a year, and I was promoted to a supervisor, where I supervised 5 company-owned restaurants. And then I went into what they call field service, where I worked with owners of McDonald's restaurants. I had about, 21 restaurants that I was responsible for, working with the owners to ensure that they, kept them clean, served good food. It was kind of interesting when they promoted me to that position. They said to me, it may be a little difficult because we've never had a Black consultant in Orange County. We don't know what their reception is going, what kind of reception you'll get. I said, okay, well, I've never run away from a challenge, so we'll see. Some of those owners are friends of mine to this day. I developed just a tremendous relationship with most of them. There was only one who that didn't happen with, but I actually was instrumental in getting him out of the system because he ran just horrible location.
What did you learn about yourself from what the perceived notion was within the corporation and then what you were able to do?
Well, the perceived notion was that we're not sure that a Black consultant will be able to get along with all of these white folks. They had never tried it before. I have a knack for getting along with almost anybody. I mean, I'm not going to judge you because of the color of your skin, but by your character. I think they were slightly surprised, meaning the corporate people, but I knew it was going to work.
You entered into the space of McDonald's after you were coming out of the adversity of your domestic violence situation with your husband. How did that relationship formally end? And how did you navigate this new professional chapter in your life while you were trying to also unravel this really challenging part of your personal life?
I filed for divorce. Needless to say, he came around several times to my cousin's house. He would never let him in. He says, she doesn't want to see you. He ultimately just agreed to the divorce. And having no money, I found a way, or there was a way where we could just do it ourselves. And it wouldn't cost very much at all. And at that time, we didn't have, there were no children involved, very limited assets. We basically just filled all the paperwork out ourselves and filed it and got a divorce. I got married again. Here we go again. Like I said, I don't make real good decisions, or I allowed myself to be convinced. There was a guy who worked for McDonald's also. He was a construction manager, and he covered several regions also. I knew I shouldn't have married him because I wasn't in love with him. The first one, I really, truly thought I loved this man. And I did everything I could to try to convince him of that. Husband number two, I knew that I wasn't really in love with him. And I even tried to tell him, I think we need to wait. But we had planned this huge wedding. He just cried. And I said, okay, all right, fine. But it didn't last either. But while we were married and we were living in San Diego, he got promoted, and I knew he would. And I had told him before he got married, I said, I'm not leaving California. You just need to know that. But he got promoted to the corporate office, which is in Chicago. And, being the dutiful wife, although I said, I'm not leaving, I followed. I was able to get the same position in Chicago. I covered Chicago and Wisconsin as a franchising manager. But, my heart was never in it. I'd say we were married maybe 2.5 years. And I told him I wanted a divorce. He's never spoken to me since.
When did you realize, you had this, you saved your money, you had this plan for what you wanted to achieve. As you said yourself, you're not extravagant and you believe in giving back. What directed your philanthropic plan? I mean, how did you decide what it is that you wanted to support? And we can get to the center, but before that, did you have an idea of the things that you wanted to support with the money that you were gifted to have?
Well, I knew that I wanted to help young people, in particular African-American young folks, help them to go to college because, just through my own experience, and as I mentioned previously, being able to see, potential opportunities that they probably don't see, in their own little family or community. Our organization in McDonald's, the National Black McDonald's Owners Association has a scholarship program. So, I've given very generously to that. Of course, domestic violence was always in the back of my mind, something that I knew I had to help with.
So how did the opportunity for the Rose Andom Center present itself to you?
Okay, when I moved to Denver in 2000, I met who is now the current mayor, and he's actually in his third term as mayor. But he was a city councilman at that time, and we became pretty good friends. I helped him with some fundraising and things of that nature. One day, and it was probably 10 years ago, I called up Michael and I said, hey, Michael Hancock is his name. He's the mayor. I said, come have lunch with me. I want to talk to you about something that I'd like to do, and I'd like to have your input. And so we met for lunch, and I said to him, I have, praise God, done very well. And I want to do something fairly big to, and give back. He asked me, he said, okay, so what are you passionate about? Of course, the first thing out of my mouth was, domestic violence, helping the survivors. I don't like calling them victims, the survivors of domestic violence. He proceeded to tell me about family justice centers that they had tried for years, he said, to get off the ground here in Denver, and they had never been successful in doing it. And he also shared with me the fact that his sister had been killed by her boyfriend, his twin sister, as a matter of fact. So it was obviously something that he was really interested in as well. That was kind of the jumping off point. I said to him, let's do it. I'm willing to donate to help this happen because there's really a need for it. It's like a one-stop shop where you can go in and the police are there. You can file a complaint. The DA's there. There are organizations that can help you get housing or a safe house, groceries, transportation, and there's counselors. So anything that a person might need that is going through that horrific experience is right there. As I said, that was probably 10 years ago. It was probably 5 years later that we actually were able to open it because we had to renovate a building and continue to raise money. But we finally opened the doors and we are celebrating 5 years.
Tell me what that feels like. What does it feel like to know that you have a legacy with your name on it that is so meaningful to not just you, but to your mother and to other women in your community?
I feel very proud that I am in a position to do something like this. I know what it felt like when I was suffering. I saw my mother suffer. Quite often, you feel really hopeless. And back in the day, I'm sure when my mother was going through this, there weren't any organizations that could help her. And even when I was going through it in late 70s, early 80s, I didn't know of any organizations that I could have gone to for assistance. So you tend to feel very vulnerable, alone, because you don't necessarily want to tell even your family or your friends what you're going through. It's embarrassing, quite honestly. So I am very proud that I am able to be a part of that. The mayor, because of the donation I made, he said, okay, I'm going to let you put the name on it. Now, I was really very reluctant to put my name on it. And I was talking to one of my girlfriends and she said, girl, you better put your name on it. You want to leave a legacy. You always tell me you want to leave a legacy. So anyway, that's how my name got on the building.
I'm curious as to what you would say to women and men, but people who are currently experiencing domestic violence. What would you say to them?
I would say get out because they don't change. They do not change. The average adult that has those type of tendencies, they're going to continue to have them. I hate to be pessimistic about it, but that's what I've seen. They just don't change. So that's what I would tell them. Get out and seek some help. There's a brighter future for you. And most of them have children. Most of the ladies who come into our center are bringing 2, 3, 4 kids with them. They're not going to change. The abuser, they're going to be abusers. So you need to get out and create a better environment for yourself and for your kids. Because I'm sure there's quite often children who witness abuse grow up to be abusers. We just try very hard to spread the news that we are there. It's amazing that sometimes I talk to people and they still, 5 years later, they still don't know that the Rose Andom Center is there. Mm-hmm. That's one of my goals, to continue to get the word out.
Are there any policies that you can think of right now that we should be thinking of on a national or local level that we should be encouraging people to support so that the work that you all do is easier?
The punishments for abusing should be stricter. And I know that's not going to end it, but I think that, if they realize, hey, I could go to prison for X number of years, they might think twice. The government should be more instrumental in providing, facilities like the Rose Andom Center, as well as safe houses, because we have several here in Denver and they're always full. It's so important, if you're in a position to do so, to give back to your communities. If you know someone that is being abused, try to help them. Try to encourage them to leave that situation, because it will never get better. I firmly believe it will never get better. And I've talked a lot about, primarily about women, but we do see some men at the center. Not many, but we do see some, and they are typically in same-sex relationships. They are, often victimized also, and they're probably even more reluctant to seek help. So, if you know anyone, female or male, encourage them to seek some help and get out of that situation. I'll never forget the day that we opened the center. A lady's husband showed up at her job and shot her in the head. They were estranged, shot her in the head and left. And I guess the other thing I would say, believe in yourself. Seek whatever assistance you might need to help realize your dreams. There's lots of opportunities out there, lots of opportunities, but we have to seek them. And quite often we need the support of those around us. My teacher when I was in high school that helped me go to college. My boss at Hallmark Cars that helped me or convinced me to get my MBA. And there's been several others who have been very instrumental in my life, and I will always be very grateful to them.
Well, Rose Andom, Denver businesswoman, philanthropist, domestic violence survivor, thank you for your tenacity, your compassion, and your generosity, and thank you for amplifying America.
You're listening to Amplify America with April Yvonne Garrett. Support Amplify America by becoming a monthly patron at patron.podbean.com/Amplify America, or making a one-time donation via Cash App or Venmo by searching Amplify America. For more information, please visit amplifyamerica.com. The way we now understand and handle domestic and intimate partner violence has evolved a great deal over the past 30 years. Ruth M. Glenn, President and CEO of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, has been at the forefront of this movement. Previously, she was employed by the Colorado Department of Human Services for 28 years and served as the director of the Domestic Violence Program for the last 9 of those years, retiring in 2013. Ruth has worked and volunteered in the domestic violence field for over 27 years and holds a master's in public administration from the University of Colorado, Denver, program on domestic violence. She has served on many domestic violence program and funding boards, provided hundreds of presentations on domestic violence victimization and survival, testified before the Colorado State Legislature and the United States Congress, and provided consultation, training, and technical assistance on a local and national level on victim-survivor issues. As a survivor, expert, and advocate, Ruth shares her experiences to bring awareness about the dynamics of domestic violence.
My name is Ruth Glenn. I am with the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence as their Chief Executive Officer.
What is domestic violence and what types of behaviors and attributes are included in that definition?
Across the nation, of course, different communities, different jurisdictions have different definitions, but we operate on the definition that domestic violence is when there are 2 people involved in some type of relationship and in which one of them causes harm deliberately to the other in their need to gain and maintain power and control over that other person. I think the one we're most familiar with, of course, is physical violence, physical abuse. We see the posters with the black eye, and not to minimize the physical abuse, but I think it's really important that when we talk about domestic violence, we also talk about the other forms of domestic violence: emotional abuse, financial abuse, mental abuse. Little known fact is that many instances of domestic violence also involve sexual violence as a means of power and control. So when we're talking about domestic violence, we always go back to the whole premise that it's someone who claims to care about someone else that is hurting that person to gain and maintain power and control.
It's interesting that you brought up the whole, black eye poster thing and what people have this understanding in their head of what it looks like. Can anyone be an abuser?
From our opinion, yes. Because remember, it's about power and control. And we see domestic violence in same-sex partnerships and in the LGBTQI community and affluent communities and poverty-stricken communities. So if we always remember that it's about the need for power and control, then we understand it crosses all those boundaries, and anyone can be an abusive person and a partner when there's domestic violence present.
When you talk about this power and control aspect, it seems to me that there are traits that abusers across socioeconomic backgrounds probably have. Can you tell us what some of those warning signs might be?
One of the areas that we haven't done a lot of work in is trying to figure out why an abuser abuses, right? So to be fair, there's no concrete behavior or view of what an abuser is, but I will tell you from my own experience in talking to many, many survivors, abusers are controllers. And it's not necessarily about their controlling their work environment or controlling other people in their lives. It's about how they begin to control that person. One of the things I like to say is watch for the person in your life that cannot seem to operate without knowing what their partner is doing, or making demands on that partner, or extricating them from social events and extricating them from other types of familial activities or even their faith-based activities. Cell phones and computers are great tools of control and power. So when you suspect that somebody may be abusive, you watch for those types of things.
Is there a type of person that is more likely to be abused than another type? I think there's this concept that it's like, oh, this person has to have terrible self-esteem, or they had these histories of abuse when they were younger. Are we missing something in that?
I am very careful about labeling who might get abused, right? In fact, the self-esteem argument makes me really uncomfortable. I was abused for 13 years, and I think that I've proven I have good esteem. And it's not that I ever had low self-esteem, but here's how I view it. And this is so general that I really want to be careful about this, but the abuser is the one that seeks out who he's going to or who she's going to control. They find a weak spot. It could be that, oh, you had abuse in your family when you were growing up, or, oh, honey, you are beautiful and you do. So it's all of those things that they seek out. I'm of the mind that you can't identify either one, the abusive person or the victimized person, because the abuser is the one that seeks out what they think will allow them to have control over someone. I've known a doctor's wife, one of the strongest women I've ever known, who, when she revealed to me that she had been terribly beaten over 20 years and ended up in the hospital twice. And I've known other women who absolutely grew up with violence in their home, but turned out to be the strongest women I know, and particularly enduring the types of abuse that they've endured. I don't think either one of them are identifiable, unfortunately, in some ways, right? Because if we could identify who might be a victim, we could pull them aside and say, hey, don't let that happen to you. And if we could identify an abuser, we could say, hey, don't even start, But we're just not at that place.
What kinds of things happen in the space of a relationship that would ultimately have you identify it as domestic violence?
I still go back to that controlling thing. I had the wonderful opportunity to present to a group of about 8 to 10 girls who were identified as being parts of the gang, right? And so as I was presenting 15, 20 minutes in, her pager goes off. I mean, this tells you how long ago it was, but her pager goes off. She runs out to the hall, makes the call, comes back in, and then her pager goes off again. So this was like during that whole hour, she must have got 4 pages. And I finally, at the end of the quick seminar, I asked her, I said, "Are you okay? What was going on?" She goes, "Oh, it's my boyfriend. He's just making sure I'm where I need to be. And, he gets jealous because he loves me." And it was a perfect example.
Right.
Perfect example. You'll see what I call hyper jealousy. You'll see hyper control over things like the car and the house. And, people will observe that, God, he's just following her around the backyard. What is that about? We're trying to do a cookout. What's happening right there? So all of those things, but particularly the hyper jealousy, because remember, it's the way of making the victim feel as though she cares and not necessarily that they're controlling. So you'll begin to see behaviors like that. Who are you on the phone with? Here's the phone bill, or you're on the phone. I thought you were talking to your mom. That's not your mom. You'll begin to see also, which is a major method, is, for instance, I'm friends with April. April and I have fun together and we talk, and all of a sudden I can't find April. We used to go to lunch together, and we used to go Friday night dancing, which is true. I love Friday night dancing. Or, those kinds of things. And now, all of a sudden she can't make it. And now when I'm calling, he's answering. She's busy. You'll see that they become separated from their families. So isolation is huge, because the more I isolate the person that I am trying to control, the more control I have.
So why is it so challenging for people to leave this type of situation?
The barriers are myriad, and it really is on an individual basis. I found it hard to leave because we worked at the same place. I had a son who was in school. We were living very well. We were tied into everything. I was very, very fearful. There's fear, there's shame, there's humiliation, there's who do I talk to? Nobody's going to believe this is happening to me. Then let's talk about some of the pragmatic and practical issues. How do I move my kids to school? Where am I going to go? What is shelter like? What will my family and friends think? Do I have family to go to? What will it mean now that I only have one income if I even have a job? Remember, sometimes abusers don't even let their victims have jobs because it gives them control. I've never managed a budget because he's paid all the bills or she's paid all the bills. How do I do that when I leave? But what I always remind people of is that victims don't get into relationships because they want it to be abused. They got into relationships because they thought they were loved and they loved. And I ask people all the time, how many times did you look back and say, oh, I was in that relationship too long? People don't get into this because they want to be abused. They get into it because they have hope and they have love, and they remain sometimes because they still have hope.
What would you say to people who are on the outskirts of this, watching this happen, watching this dynamic play out? What kind of advice would you give them to start gingerly and gently allowing that person or those people in that relationship to know that you're present for them and you want them to have a place to land and come to feel safe when they're trying to sort all this out?
There are a couple of things that you touched on also that is really important to me, that unintentionally sometimes we shame that person. That would never happen to me. I don't know why you put up with this. Or, all of those things, particularly in our community, let's be honest.
Right.
And I heard it many times. But also, in order to quit shaming, you need to understand the dynamics of domestic violence. So if I understand that there is something that's going on with April and my spidey senses are going off, I'm going to go to some website or something like that and find out about domestic violence. Then I would say, be very careful for your own safety, but also understand that if you're feeling that, what must that person be feeling? And then very supportively and very gingerly say, I know something is going on for you. Don't identify it, because sometimes they don't even know that there's domestic violence, but I know something's going on for you. When and if you're ready to talk, I am here for you. And then make sure you have the resources available yourself to be able to share with that person, whether it's the National Domestic Violence Hotline or the local program that provides services or whatever it might be. Somebody that you know is an advocate that can guide that person, and be willing to know that once you say, I'm here for you and I'm making myself available to hear from you, that you'll probably and may not get the response you want. They may say, what are you talking about? Because it's embarrassing. So be prepared for the response. Be prepared to provide something to that person when and if they reveal that. Do not say, why don't you leave? The survivor has the right and is the only one that can make that decision for their own safety and for their children's safety, and particularly when there's children involved. But I tell women all the time, my favorite group to talk to is victims in shelter. I love talking to them and say, I can hear from you about what you felt when the hairs on your arm stood up, or you went to sleep and as you dozed off, you went, wait a minute, that's not love. Or wait a minute, he won't let me talk to my family. You can talk to me about that because I get that. Now, let's also talk about that's not your fault. They found your weaknesses and worked them their way in and figured out what kind of abuses would be most effective on you. Let's be honest about that too. We had some good times. I'm a dancer. He was a dancer. We both just loved to dance. There were good times with my son. So when you have the good times and then the bad time happens, you're like, wait a minute, it's not okay. There was definitely ebb and flow. I often look at that chart we used to use that says, it'll build up, build up, build up. And it always took the straight line. It's an old model that used to be used in domestic violence. And I'm like, oh, no, no. Because there might have been 2 weeks between an incident. There might have been 2 months between an incident. There could have been 8-9 months in between an incident. What would happen is I would get comfortable that things were going to be okay. My hope builds up and then an explosion. But I will also say that in that 13 years that I was actually married to him, I never did not walk on eggshells, just waiting for the next incident. There was physical abuse. There were other types of violence, sexual violence. There was emotional abuse. He was so good at the coercion and the emotional piece. And particularly as he began to escalate the last couple of years before I left, it really turned into more of, you think you're all that, you're nothing, that kind of thing. It was very interesting when I look back on it.
I appreciate the fact that you just said to me, there were ebbs and flows, because I do think that people believe that in relationships, wherever abuse is present, whatever type of abuse it is, that it is a 24-hour thing.
Right.
I have people that I love who will say, go through this cycle with someone, and then they'll have a good day, and they live for that good day. And I think that's what people really don't understand about these types of relationships, is that when you have that wonderful moment, it goes back to what you were saying. Oh, you're reminding me of why I chose you, where there's love here. All of these things that people from the outside might be thinking, you're crazy, this is terrible, every time I see you guys together, it's bad. But they don't know that those are the moments that, people kind of live to see another day, to see that moment.
And to be quite frank with you, I also really wanted my child to have a father.
Sure.
He was my only son. I felt very strongly that I wanted this family to work.
In the moment, what was obvious to you as the impact? And then as you look back on it, what were the longer term impacts? Not just on you, but you and your son.
In the moment, it was horrible. Everything from not being able to walk for a few days, from being tossed into a wall, to self-medication. I self-medicated with alcohol and drugs for 4 years, watching and waiting for the abuse to be extended to my son, which it actually did end up happening, at the later part of our marriage, and was part of the reason I left, because I realized then, okay, well,
So can I pause you? Because were you one of those people where it was like, okay, when it happened to me, I have my reasons for staying. But when it happens to my child, cross the line now. We got to.
That's right.
Okay.
Bingo. And it turned pretty quickly. I mean, one day I was like, wait a minute, this is really bad. But one of the other interesting things is I really thought I was keeping the abuse from my son that was being inflicted on me. He was very, very open and is still very traumatized about what happened to me and to him.
When did he first start talking to you about what he experienced in that situation? How old was he?
Well, there were 2 times because he does not talk about it.
Okay.
Except one of the times was probably about a year after his father committed suicide. He was medicated. He was using substances, alcohol, and he just let it out, and I let him. I felt
and how old was he at the time?
17.
Got it.
And then one other time when he was 22, totally different circumstances. To be quite honest with you, I called the police on him because I felt like he was being abusive to his girlfriend at the time. And I had made up my mind that whatever I could do was not going to happen. He was not going to hurt women. And he ended up in jail overnight. When he got out, we had a long talk about it. And it was like, well, I witnessed it. And, and I felt like he was making excuses or justifying his behavior. And I said, no, you make a conscious choice to do it. And that was the first moment, too, that the kind of light went off for me. No, because I have told you, to my knowledge and understanding, he has not been as abusive as I thought he was being that day. And he hadn't even hit her, but he was cornering her and, doing that whole I'm in control thing. And I said, oh no, you got 5 minutes to figure out walking outside or I'm going to call the police. And I did.
I want to pause this here because this is super important to me and hopefully to this audience. I need for you to expressly state what I think is obvious in what you're saying. And that is how important it is, especially when you have children, for you to understand that they don't miss a thing.
That's right. They do not.
And also how it's not just the physical, tactical experience of seeing domestic abuse or degradation in any way, shape, or form, but that trauma is emotional, spiritual, psychological, intellectual, but also that the trauma is trapped in their bodies. I want you to speak to what you know about that, not just from your personal experience, but in this work.
To be very careful about it, when there is domestic violence, degradation, whatever's happening in the home and it's violence, let's call it all violence because that's what it is. It's a violence to your body. It's a violence to your psyche. It's a violence to who you are. You are being protective of your child because you think that you're shielding them from that, and that's okay. But recognize that the protection only goes so far because now that trauma is being transferred to them. I will never, ever say that I was not a protective mother. I was doing the best that I could under the circumstances. And it wasn't until later that I understood that I wasn't being as protective as I thought I was. I don't hold any guilt about that, finally. So I don't want your audience to also think that people that aren't protecting their children aren't protecting their children. They are. They're doing the best that they can under those circumstances. But you are also correct that when a parent who is close to that child is being hurt, the child is also being hurt. And we may not even know it for years later. My son is still in PTSD. Still. He's 44, and he is still living in PTSD trauma. I am too. I have chosen other ways, such as advocating and that kind of thing, to deal with it. But you're absolutely correct. When someone is hurting someone that they say they love, and there are children present, they are also being traumatized. And we may see the abusive parent being very loving to that child, and the child becomes the center of their care and concern. We should also remember that that child is still also witnessing the violence that's being perpetrated. So it's probably even more confusing for that child. The protective parent is being protective, given all they know, the best that they can do, thinking that they're shielding. And what's happening is all of that trauma is also being shared with that child.
So can you tell everybody what was the cushion? What was the moment that this relationship ended, and what were the circumstances of the relationship ending?
About 3 years before I left him, I showed up to work after having to call in sick a couple of days from a beating. It was actually my last beating. My supervisor pulled me aside and said, "I know what's going on for you." And I thought she was going to fire me. And she said, no, I know what's going on for you. I'm here for you, blah, blah, blah. And I totally denied it. I said, what? No, that's not happening. It was the seed that planted in my mind to say, she's right. I'm embarrassed to talk about it. I'm shamed. And I'm hurting so bad, not physically. I was even suicidal briefly, very briefly. And then I remembered my son, because she had brought all of this stuff to my forefront, just with those simple words. It took me 2 years to leave. I hid money, figured out my best safety. I hid my precious belongings, because sometimes it's not even the physical against you or the emotional against you. It's destroying your property. He was very good at that too. And so I hid all of my personal, emotional stuff in the crawl space. We basically snuck out. We waited until he was at work. I went and got a U-Haul. We loaded up everything. We went to an apartment I was able to get by saving money. Remember, we were like, the 2-car, nice house, hot tub, all good appearances. We played cards with the neighbors. They had no idea. So it was interesting. So I got a U-Haul. We left on a Friday night. He became very, very, very escalated and threatened everyone in my life over the weekend. By Monday morning, he found us.
Do you have a clue as to how he found you?
It was in the day when they didn't have the same kind of security in banks. And his girlfriend went in, pretended like she was me, and got my address off the computer just by looking over the bank teller's shoulder, and wiped out my account. Because it wasn't about that he needed the money.
Control.
It was, and he would always say, because he would also steal my car, and he'd say, well, what are you going to do now? As though I can't do anything without him. And I figured it all out for 8 months. The other thing that's really important in this story is, remember, I left him, and 8 months later is when he found me and shot me.
Okay, wait. Okay, so the whole story about the bank happened 8 months later.
No, 8 months. That was the first instance after I left.
Okay, so he kind of knew, he had a frame of reference about where you were at that point.
Oh, he knew the exact address. He showed up at our home. I was on the phone, and they got us out of there. The police got us out of the home because he showed up at the home. That's how I knew he knew my address.
So he knew for 8 months where you lived?
Yes.
So you lived knowing for 8 months with your child in this location, that at any time he could show up.
Right. At the 6-month mark, he actually kidnapped me and held me hostage. I was able to get away from that. I went to the apartment complex, and they moved us to another apartment in the same address, which was fine. When I left, he found us within 3 days. For the next 8 months, he harassed, stalked, kidnapped. I mean, it was frightening to leave our home. We ended up in safe house twice, ended up at a friend's house twice, just trying to get away from that. So at the 6-month mark is when he kidnapped me, and at the 8-month mark, it's when he tried to kill me. That's the other reason why we say, don't say, why don't you leave? I did everything right. Everything. I got my own home, my own tiny, tiny studio apartment for me and my son. I had my own job. I was on the phone trying to get a protection order and divorce papers when he found us. And thank God I was on the phone with them, because they were like, get on the floor. We're calling the police for you. I never depended on him. I did everything right, and he still did that. So we have to be really, really, really careful. But I also knew that if I didn't do this, I couldn't live with myself anymore. I knew that the potential of him killing me was very, very high. But I made that decision myself.
So when you were on this call and they made the call to make sure you were safe, the police navigated getting you out of there. Did he escape the police?
He was gone by the police by the time the police got there.
Okay.
And there was nothing they could have done anyway. I was still married to him. There was no National Domestic Violence Hotline. There was no public awareness about domestic violence. I didn't understand what was until my boss said that to me. And I'm not even sure she said those words, but it was like, oh, okay. In both the kidnapping and the shooting, though they were very different experiences, they were still the whole thing that I was married to him. I also found it very difficult to navigate systems because I fell through a crack. I'm not getting out my tiny violin, but I can't imagine how it must feel for those that had less means than I did. I couldn't get counseling because I made too much money. I couldn't do this because I made not enough money. So I was one of those people that fell in that really weird place back in 1992, 93, 94. So I can't imagine how it must be for someone living in poverty or on one income or has 3 children and trying to do this. I just can't even imagine.
Your boss saw something and thought enough to say something about it. When he was going around to your family and terrorizing everybody in the situation, how did they respond to that?
You know, a bunch of my brothers, of course, wanted to come out and do something. And I said, don't you dare, because of my fear for them. My mom went into a very strange denial. It was very odd. So there wasn't a lot. And one of the things that's really key to this is when I talked about isolation, him and I grew up in California. By the time we got married, I was in Colorado. I knew no one.
So you were completely isolated.
And his family was here. It was really isolating, particularly in the early years. The other thing is I did not want others to be in his line of sight. So I was very careful about involving other people in what was going on. You know, people volunteered to help me and my son pack the U-Haul. And I said, oh no, it's bad enough my son is here. But if he should happen to come home, there's no telling. When he kidnapped me and took me into the hotel to sign, I just prayed to God for somebody else. So you're always so there's another reason why you don't leave, right?
Right.
Who else is going to be hurt?
Knowing what you know now as an advocate and what you've seen in the evolution of this, what would you tell those people around you now would have been helpful to you in that moment?
I think it would be a little different from now than if it was happening to me in 1992. But in general, here's what I would say. Hang in there. Educate yourself about what might be going on, and then have conversations about it, not just with that person you think is being harmed, but conversations like you and I are having. Understanding who's to be accountable and who's being hurt. Understanding all of the different ways in which that occurs. And then say, let's have a conversation about it. I used to do a brief training. Well, I did a couple of briefs for the state agency here in Colorado when I was still working with them. And it was on our domestic violence policy. And I said, we're not talking about it. All of us have seen colleagues that we go, I wonder what's going on. Why does she have a scarf on right now? Or, why is her phone ringing incessantly? Or, why is he going down the hall, nowadays with the cell phone constantly? Have the conversations about what is really happening for Joe or Julie. What's really going on?
And I think there's an aspect to people needing to divorce themselves from judgment and learning how to hold the space for people and who they are right now. There's like sort of a radical acceptance that people seem to really have a hard time with because they're constantly projecting their values, what they think they would do in these situations, and judging. And that just, to me, seems like it just exacerbates the situation because it just sends people in a deeper guilt and shame spiral. So they're less likely to have a conversation with you about it, or less likely to try to do a game plan or want to pull you into it, because in addition to the horror of what they're experiencing, they're also feeling the guilt and shame of public exposure of what exactly is happening.
Right. Totally. We need to understand domestic violence so that we can push aside that judgment. that idea. I go back to when we first started this conversation, oh, that would never happen to me. Well, you be careful what you say. And from my perspective, then you're putting this layer of stuff of judgment and all of that on top of what might give you the opportunity to understand.
But now I want to talk about your advocacy work, because as the CEO and president of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, you now lead an organization that supports the efforts that demand change in these conditions that lead to domestic violence. But before that, you worked for the Colorado Department of Human Services for 28 years. It's a long time. And then served as director of the domestic violence program for the last 9 of those years. So I was really curious about how that work evolved over the decades that you were in that space. Because like I said, when you were experiencing this, it's like, oh my word, like, I don't even know if we knew the language. And I mean, I was graduating from college in 1992. I know we had shelters and they were domestic violence shelters, but we weren't really talking about it. I don't think that there was a public conversation. I don't think there was a lot of language around it. I just think it was something that we kind of hidden in plain sight. Oh, it's their problem. I might know somebody, but it's not my real issue. Or I grew up with it and I still don't see it as a big deal because we all act like it didn't happen. So I want to know from an advocacy perspective, with all that you've been able to bring to the table, how that career evolved for you.
Right. This is a perfect opportunity to say too, is that I think I'm not unique in figuring out how to do advocacy after having done that. I mean, I know lots of advocates who are, for the most part, really good advocates because they've experienced it and they have an understanding about society's mores and isms that allow for that. So they can work from that perspective. I was 15 years into my career at the department when all of this happened. And interestingly enough, the crossroads for me was when he did pass away. All of that had happened. And I was thinking, okay, now what do I do? I'm still working for the department, blah, blah, blah. And then I began to seek out little opportunities for growth. So within the department, but then also figuring out, well, maybe I should just go to the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence, let them know I'm a survivor and I want to do something. Because all of this realization came flooding through me about what I had experienced. I began to find ways to further my education and understanding about domestic violence, volunteer when I could. So I started serving on boards and domestic violence boards and agency boards that dealt with domestic violence. And within our department, there was a position that was the domestic violence program director position, which was really a main functioning of administering grants. When the person finally retired from that position, and she had come to me a few months before and said, I'm going to be retiring, and I think you could do this. And I said, okay. And so I served there for 9 years as the director of the domestic violence program. What I found most frustrating there is I wasn't allowed, or there wasn't room or space for advocacy. It was a funding arm. So I could advocate a little bit to our leadership within the department, but it never felt like it was good. It never felt strong and powerful. I did not feel like survivors' voices were being heard in a system that by its own design in some ways should be bureaucratic. It just couldn't wrap its head around advocacy. And I remember one day I thought, I can't do this anymore. I just can't. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to retire and figure out the rest of my life. Maybe I'll be in a fetal position for the rest of my life. I don't know. About 4 months later, a thing popped up on my screen that said, announcing the resignation of X from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I thought, well, I can do an interim director there for a little while I figure out the rest of my life. And I signed up for 3 months and said, I can do this for 3 months. And here we are 6 years later. I really, really love advocating. I will also be honest, because of my own trauma, I can't do direct service. I recognized that myself immediately. Years and years ago, I said, I can't. It's too triggering for me. Once I talk to a survivor, or especially in the early years, I can do it now pretty comfortably, but I would walk away an emotional wreck. So to do it at this level, that's not only what I hope is impacting change and moving people, but healthy for me. I'm always saying don't think that I'm doing this as some kind of, martyr, because I get a lot out of it too.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think when I talk to people around the issues that I'll be covering across the country, that people who are in the care business, I don't know, I feel like as a culture, as a society, we just see them as like these automatons who may have had some kind of experience with this particular issue, but we don't think about what's going on in their interiors for them to be committed to this work every day and what it actually costs them, right? So it's not just a matter of just, okay, well, I'm an advocate and you see me, when I'm speaking at this conference or this convention, but like, what is the real impact of being in this space over and over again? And you being able to say, I can't do the direct services stuff because it's way too much is super important, because I think that folks don't understand that it does have a cost. It does have a toll.
Oh gosh, yes. Even today, quite frankly, there have been times when I'm doing a media interview or a podcast or, whatever it might be. And I go home and I go, why am I feeling so off? And I go, oh, that's why. So between that and this job, and I tell people all the time, don't think I'm 100%. That's not real. Yeah. There are days I'm down to 50% capacity, emotional and traumatic and all of that. There are days I'm at 90 and I'm feeling like I can take on the world and bring it, because that trauma is, and I'm going to say it again one more time, it's the fabric of your life. And if we don't recognize that today is not the day, or that today was the day that it took everything out of me, and now I'm going to go in my bed. I don't eat ice cream because I'm lactose, but it's that metaphor of eating the pint of ice cream. Mine is, I'm going to go lay in a fetal position and take care of Ruth for just a few minutes.
It's so interesting that you say that, because as someone who also deals with PTSD, it's really hard to experience PTSD and then have people around you who don't really understand it, and then be able to take some time for yourself and literally not put them at the center of your recovery in that moment. Because one of the things about the loved ones that I have that surround me now that sometimes they don't understand is, like, when I say I need a break, it's not about you. But if I tried to explain it to you in that moment, I'm doing double damage to myself.
Right.
So I have to just take that time away. And it's really important that you and I have this conversation and say that, because otherwise people, but you're always fine and you're always great and you're always taking care of other people and you're always, I am not always anything. I constantly tell people, you have no idea how much I work at this.
Right.
It's morning, it is noon, it is night, it is sometimes in between. Sometimes I'm taking on your stuff and I can't really take it. It's too much. It triggers me, whatever. But I think if we're not having those conversations, then people don't know. And for those of us who've been through these experiences, we're used to people piling on and then being like, but you're okay because you're always okay. It's, no, I am not always okay.
I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. You're always okay. No, I'm not.
And when you say back to someone, no, I'm not okay, they look at you like, what are you talking about? You're supposed, and it's all of the societal things, especially for Black women. It's like, well, you're supposed to be taking care of everybody. And
that's right.
And actually, we don't care if you take care of yourself, really, as long as you take care of us. So
that's right.
I'm glad that you said that. I want to pivot a little bit to the work of your organization. And I spent hours on your website because I was like, oh my God, this is fascinating. I'm like sending links to people. I'm like, oh my God, did you know this? And people are reading stuff like, ooh, I have a lot of stuff I need to look at in my relationship because these lists are just a little too close to home. It was really interesting. But there were two incredible resources that I wanted to bring to light, because when I heard you talk about your transition from this relationship to the rest of your life, there was something in you that said, I need to squirrel this money away. I need to squirrel these possessions away. Yes. This is where I put it. So when I saw the personal safety plan in particular in the financial education project, I was like, hooray, this is amazing. Yeah. So I just was like, I can't, just reading through the personal safety plan and looking at some of the things that I never even considered, right? Like you have to be in a safe place to make these calls. These are the documents that you need to have when you call into a place. Try not to get into your narrative as much as you tell them precisely what your needs are in this moment. We can get into your narrative after you're in a safe place. Right. I didn't even think of these things. So I wanted to know a little bit about how those things came about and what kind of feedback you got from people who actually use them.
Every community domestic violence program has some template of a safety plan that they help victims and survivors with. It's part of the advocacy. Interestingly enough, April, victims and survivors have usually, by the time that we, the domestic violence field, sees them, have already developed their own safety plan, just not knowing that they had followed. Now, they may have forgotten to get their birth certificate, but they may have squirreled money away. So there's different kinds of things. We know that when somebody's abusive, the control doesn't stop because the victim has left. So the main message about a safety plan is do as much as you can right now, because you may not be able to do it later. They may burn your passport. They may take your driver's license. They may make sure that you don't have access to your child's school records or immunization records or whatever it might be. They may empty out your bank account by the time you get into shelter on a Saturday night because they block lines, and that's really minimizing. There's been an incident which got you to shelter, but by Monday morning, you have no money. So always think, I tell people all the time, this is going to sound awful, but it was survival. I began to think like he did.
Got
what
it.
would he do if I did X?
Yeah.
He stole my car keys once, so I made 2 sets of them, or a set of them. When he stole them again, I did another one. By the time I left, I had probably 2 or 3 sets of car keys hidden, because that was a tactic of control. You're not going anywhere. I'm going to work, and you're going to sit your buns right here. I like to remind people that sometimes victims and survivors, as part of their safety plan, need to think like the perpetrator. What will they do if I do X? They have hurt my pet. So let me make sure that my pet also has accommodations. We've heard of survivors that don't leave because of their pets. Sad. But they know that something is going to happen. Either they can't find anywhere to go with their pet, or something is going to happen if they leave the pet. That's sad. So all of those, the safety plan for most victims and survivors is up here. We hope to offer this checklist to help them. They may not have thought about this piece or that piece. So that's how that came about.
And then the financial education piece.
Economic abuse is prevalent, and particularly in this day and time when women are making their own incomes. But what we're finding, and what we found over time, is that they may be making a paycheck and it goes into the joint account and they never see it again. Or we've heard stories, as unbelievable as it is, I believe it, but we've heard stories of abusive persons taking the paycheck, literally taking it from them and saying, this is your keep. This is how we get this house running. You don't get to keep your money. Or having the abusive person be the only one that is managing the finances. You get X to spend, I get this to manage. And when you get ready to go, you don't know how much you have, you don't know how to manage your checkbook. The list goes on and on. Oh my God, what do you mean I have to do a rental application? I've never done an application before for a house, apartment. So all of those things tie into that economic abuse. And then how do we make sure that we get financial education to you so that you understand all of those pieces?
So powerful and so important.
Yeah.
So let's explore some policy imperatives.
Yes.
I know that we are stuck with a policy that we have been trying to get full passage of. Could you explain to us what the Violence Against Women Act is and where does it stand right now? And also, what can we do to advance its full passage?
The Violence Against Women Act is up for reauthorization. We have heard from this administration that they hope to be able to get it passed within the first 100 days. What I do want to mention is another important one, though. This is, in some ways, to me, even more important than VOCA, Victims of Crime Act dollars. Mm-hmm. Their appropriations has taken a huge amount of money from that fund. That fund is a core resource for domestic violence programs across the nation, and they've already taken a cut a couple of years ago. We're trying to get what's called a VOCA fix across the finish line so that they don't take that cut from it. My fear is that cut will result in some really significant cuts to programs, and you know who then becomes the victims of that. They are already dealing with so much as a result of COVID. And then to have the programs taking an even more of a cut from what is their core. So not only is it a core for programs, but it's also a core for victims, because victims also access that fund to get counseling, to get other needs that they have, their medical bills. For instance, gunshot victims access that fund to get their needs met. Domestic violence victims, sexual assault victims, the Victims of Crime Act money covers so much for victims. And when we talk about cutting that, when domestic violence programs and victims are already experiencing a shortfall of resources because of COVID, it's quite frankly the craziest thing I've ever seen.
Well, the other thing that I'm concerned about is that there's this whole diversity of enforcement around firearms and domestic abusers. And so why is it important to enforce the removal of firearms from the possession of domestic abusers? And how is it being addressed in diverse communities across the country?
I'm going to answer your first question. It's so important. We're seeing a rise in lethality for those who are experiencing domestic violence where firearms are present. I think the ability to take that 1 second that it takes to pull the trigger, it has really been harmful for those experiencing domestic violence, and we're seeing more and more deaths. Don't forget also that a firearm is very effective in threatening, harassing, and if you just know it's there, it really does trap victims even more so. The enforcement of a removal is really challenging because there's a federal law. There isn't teeth in that federal law to say that as X jurisdiction, you have to do it. You have to do a thorough background check. You have to do this. You have to do that. The other thing to offer the benefit of the doubt is that we also know that some communities don't have the capacity and resources to do it themselves. There might be a rural community somewhere that is in total agreement, although some communities are not, but they don't know where to store the gun and what does it mean to, remove the gun, and how long do we remove the gun, and all of those types of things. But enforcement of removal, and then figuring out how to make sure that we do the most thorough background checks possible to include misdemeanors and or unadjudications of domestic violence are very, very important. And then the second piece, of course, is I'm growing where I don't like the name of it, but the boyfriend loophole. We're also not talking about those who are experiencing domestic violence from their dating partners and stalking, right? We're missing a group that has experienced harm because of our inability to enforce, because they're not married and they're not co-inhabitating and blah, blah, blah. Well, I only dated this guy for 2 months. I don't know what's happening. I left him because of domestic violence, and now I'm at risk, even though he's got police reports of getting shot. So those two in regards to firearms and domestic violence are most important to us.
What are the most positive impacts that you can think about that define your work?
I think what I have the most pride in being here is what I hope is that survivor voice, is that saying, don't say that to me. I'm a survivor, and let me tell you what I think. Now, I don't speak for all survivors because we're all also individuals. So when it comes to the dynamics of domestic violence and understanding policy, projects, programs, public awareness, and all of those things, my hope is that I'm lending that perspective to it. That's not to denigrate anyone who's not a survivor and doing this work. I also say to you that I think that this organization has done a phenomenal job in raising awareness about this issue particularly over the last couple of years. We don't have any federal or government grants, so we are people-powered. We seek donations and get donations from people who believe in us and believe in what we do, and they make things work, and we owe it to them as well to say we're going to make change. Whenever the opportunity arises, we are what I hope is front and center on this issue as a national entity. If you want to talk about domestic violence and you want to talk policy and you want to talk programming and all of that, you come to NCADV. I know there are other national organizations doing the work, but I think when you look at a true survivor-centric, people-powered entity that is grassroots and tries to get the issue from here to here, it's us.
What are the challenges you face?
Right off the top of my head, that we're people powered. It's interesting because a lot of my job is fundraising. I think I've expressed to you that I much prefer advocacy work and programming work and policy work. But I also understand that there are people out there that believe in what we're doing, and we're doing it for the advocates who are on the ground, and we're doing it for survivors. So when I think about my frustration and my angst about fundraising and or seeking donors, I understand that. The other thing that I find most challenging, and particularly on the hot topic issues, is navigating those that I feel I need to help understand why we're talking about that. I'll use the gun issue. I know you can imagine some of the backlash to that. You know, don't infringe on my Second Amendment rights. That's not what we're doing. So some of the frustration that I have, and I have to remind myself, is that not everyone is incapable of understanding. And unfortunately, you might have to sometimes help them understand why that's an important issue, whatever it is.
So what would help you do this work more effectively?
One is, I look forward to the day, because I still know it's coming, that we have a large donor who says, I want to make a difference. I want to be with you and partner with you to have that happen, so that resources can be allocated to the other places, such as programming and projects and policy. The second thing is just give us one more body, give us one more personnel that can fill some capacity, because we can never fully do what we're asked to do. I have to sometimes say we can't do it as much as I want to, or we want to. We just don't have the capacity.
What are some of the universal volunteer opportunities that someone might be able to participate wherever they live to support people who are doing work around domestic violence?
Please reach out to your local domestic violence program and ask them what they need. I can't tell you how many times, I get an email, or somebody gets an email here in the office that says, I have all of these toiletries left over from my travel. And well, I think that's wonderful, but I'm not sure that's what they need.
Right.
What is it that program needs? It can be money. It could be, I need 10 gift cards for $10 to Target. I need extra large clean packs of jockey underwear. I need someone to give a victim a $200 Southwest coupon so that they can get out of this state. Always call the local domestic violence program and say, how can I help? What do you need?
What should be our core value as a nation around domestic violence?
Our core value should be allowing victims and survivors to tell you what's happened for them, letting them have a voice in everything that we do, understanding the dynamics of domestic violence, and then what does accountability look like for those that harm others?
Well, Ruth Glenn, domestic violence survivor advocate expert, thank you for holding the nation accountable for this precious population, and thank you so much for amplifying America.
Thank you for the invite, and thank you for asking such great questions that we can hopefully get other people talking about it.
Navigating leaving relationships defined by domestic and intimate partner violence is always a challenge. In Colorado, thanks to the generosity of benefactor Rose Andom, for the past 5 years, the Rose Andom Center has served as a place for domestic violence victims to find the safety, support, and services needed to rebuild their lives and heal their families. Nicole Castillo is its program director.
I'm Nicole Castillo, and I'm the program director for the Rose Andom Center.
What does domestic violence look like in Colorado, in Denver in particular?
I would say that we see a lot of folks who have multiple vulnerabilities. They're facing homelessness, a lot of folks for whom English is not their first language, a lot of economic disparities. So especially with the Rose Andom Center, because we have such a close connection with our criminal justice partners, we see quite lethal cases, a lot of physical violence. We're seeing more gang-related activities, sex trafficking. I would say that it's what people would think of when they think about some of the harder parts about domestic violence.
Tell me a little bit about the history, how old you are, and what is the mission of your work?
The center was a dream for many, many years of our community partners. We are celebrating our 4th anniversary this year. And our mission is to provide access to services in one single safe location. The Family Justice Center movement differentiates itself from general domestic violence organizations in the sense that it is the collaboration. It is the domestic violence providers, in our case, Safe House Denver, along with all the other partners from criminal justice to civil legal services, housing, medical, all in one place.
What are the demographics of the people you serve? I'm imagining that people have in their minds what a domestic violence victim or survivor may look like, but what are you seeing that might be a little bit different from what people think?
For the Rose Andom Center, I would say the majority of the folks we serve identify as female, and I think the average age is probably in the mid-30s. Most of them have children. I think we have a fairly good proportion of folks that identify as Hispanic, Latinx, and then a small portion that are probably from other ethnic minorities, but I would say the majority probably identify as white.
Among the core services you provide are counseling, support, and protection. Can you explain how each of those works to help anyone experiencing domestic violence in Denver?
For us, the primary request that clients have is for civil legal support. So that's obtaining a protection order, support with a divorce and custody. Only during the pandemic have we seen that the need for rental assistance and housing has surpassed the requests for civil legal. So it's very straightforward and easy to access those services. We have really great partners, Project Safeguard, and they provide all of our civil legal support. They're trauma informed. They meet clients where they are. They have bilingual advocates, and they help them to complete all the paperwork necessary for the protection orders.
With the counseling, do you do it in-house or do you recommend people out?
We offer a range of counseling options. We have domestic violence counseling that's offered by our partners, Safe House Denver. So that's more like psychoeducational counseling, helping folks to understand their experience through the lens of domestic violence. We also offer psychotherapy through our partners, Maria Drost Counseling Services. And then because we have the clinic in-house, we can offer behavioral health support as well.
Let's round it out a little bit to say Rose Andom Center is a home, as a hub for these things, and then tell me how the hub actually functions in times when we're not separated from one another because of COVID, and then also how you're functioning because of COVID.
The Rose Andom Center staff is comprised of, I would say, two main groups. The navigators, they're the first point of contact, and the intake specialists, who are sort of the equivalent of an advocate. What the navigator does is start to meet the client, wherever they are in their process. If they're coming in for a walk-in, maybe they just had an incident over the weekend, maybe they're reaching out for the first time over the phone, and they help to provide that emergency safety planning in connection to services that can't wait. So that could be something like a protection order or medical services. From there, they're connected with an intake specialist, and the way that I see the intake specialist is they're sort of like the co-pilot for the client. We believe survivors understand their experience the best. And what the intake specialist does is they help to work with them to navigate through all of the various resources and services that they'll need. And so the intake specialists then make the referrals and connections to all the community partners who are in the building. And they stay with them through that process. So if it turns out it wasn't the right referral or they need to do a different route, then they come back to their intake specialists who continue to work with them.
When someone comes in and they get to a navigator or they get to an intake, what are you all thinking? What are the prevailing notions in your mind that when someone comes in that state of crisis, what is top of mind for the people who are serving them at the Rose Andom Center?
I would say urgently their safety. It's not uncommon that the folks that come to the Rose Andom Center will be without a safe place to go. And again, I think that is different than some other places. We are, I think, the front lines. I would say the most important thing is, does this person have somewhere safe to go in the next 24 hours for us to even be able to do some of this other work together?
What is the impact of the pandemic on the prevalence of domestic violence and on the support services that you and others in the area are able to offer?
When we first went home, which was now a year ago, the phones were not ringing as much at first. And we suspect that that's because folks were trapped at home and they didn't have a safe way to communicate with us. And then I would say around the beginning of the fall, our numbers doubled. So it was this just complete shift. And some folks have speculated that this is because the order had been lifted, so more people were coming out again and could access the resources. I also think by then the economic strain was just unavoidable. And when we talk about what are the reasons that domestic violence survivors stay, it's often because there are so many barriers for them to flee. And of course, economics is like top of that. Also, our community partners were very strained. So we have a lot of city partners, and in some cases, folks were furloughed or positions were not filled because of just the finances. So that meant there was a lot more work to do and fewer people to do the work. And also the needs were much more complicated.
Explain to me those complications and those needs, because I'm sure you were used to seeing a certain kind of flow of needs. So then you also had in place how to deal with that. And then all of a sudden the pandemic happens and those needs get aggregated in a very different way. First, explain what you typically saw before the pandemic, and then tell me what you saw after the pandemic that you have to really get nimble about and try to create some solutions for.
Probably top of the mind is shelter. The Rose Andom Center is not a shelter, but we make the referrals to domestic violence shelters. And with the pandemic, many of the shelters, of course, had to reduce capacity for the health and well-being of the residents. And yet we had a huge need for shelter. So what we started doing is actually putting folks in hotels. Luckily, there was good funding to support that, but that was very complicated. We're a small staff and we don't technically even have shelter staff. We were, and we still are, essentially running like these remote shelters through hotels.
How many people do you think you've helped in that time period?
I think this last year we served around 1,500 people.
Given all of that, what are the main challenges you face as an organization and then the space of people who are working collaboratively and collectively to try to ameliorate this problem?
We face the same barriers everyone faces in terms of the systemic oppressions, right? So while access to services is great, there are still these huge hurdles in society that we encounter too. And we're trying to create solutions for people in broken systems.
When I was talking to Ruth, she was like, I think Americans still see domestic violence as the poster with the black eye, right? And I think they see it as a particular population, a particular class of people, a particular race of people or whatever. When you think about how we think about it in our heads, what are the ways in which we have to push the envelope from what is so right now and what needs to be so that we can address this and start to unravel it from the core? And then talk to me a little bit about the broken systems. I think we assume that certain things are in place that absolutely aren't. And I'll get into asking you about policies in a minute, because I think that's critical, because you need that structural change so that we can start to change the minds and the actions. But first, talk to me about the systemic oppressions and what is the substance of that? And what is a residue of that, right? And then talk about how that feeds into broken systems, because that leads people to support policy initiatives and all of these things.
Yeah, what you shared and what Ruth said, I think it makes me reflect a lot about the family court system. So an experience that I've had is that prior to working at the Rose Andom Center, I worked in Newton, Massachusetts at a hospital. And the folks that I worked with there were all well-educated and probably would be considered affluent. And that really illuminated for me how broken the systems are, because these are folks who had access, right? Like they could pay for their own housing. The things that we think are sometimes the easy solutions, right? Like people need education or they need money. These people had that. And they still would have really terrible experiences in the family court systems where oftentimes protective parents lost custody of their children. And that speaks to an entire reform that needs to be made in the family court system. So we see the same things with Rose Andom clients who don't have that type of access. I think that there are these systemic issues that run across socioeconomic class that unless people have really been in those situations or had family members who had, would never believe that that's how the US is right now.
What additional resources would make it easier for you to achieve your mission? I mean, it sounds like you have a really good, robust collective of folks who work with you. And like you said, you're nimble. So you get to say, all right, for this moment, this isn't working. And so let's go in another direction. But if you could kind of pull something out of a hat for this moment, like say, all right, this is the thing that we need right now because this is what we're experiencing right now. What do you think that would be?
I think we need more people to help folks access housing. It is like a tsunami we face. I think that the systems, even though we've tried to improve them, they're incredibly complicated. Most folks that we work with, they need support, like just, filling out applications, identifying places to live. And there are not very many organizations that have the staff capacity to provide that. And when you think about the trauma that folks experience, that impacts their ability to retain information. Some folks have, a lot of people actually we're learning have traumatic brain injuries. And so if you take like just someone that's under some stress and duress, and then they compile all of these additional factors, and now they have to navigate a system to find housing that's way more complicated than what the average person has to think about when they're renting an apartment. It's significant. And I would say that we need more support, whether that's through volunteers or people donating to organizations in their area to really close the gap there. While we wait for the systems to improve, there's still a lot of navigating that needs to be done.
There are a number of policies on a national level that affect domestic violence. What are some of the ones you're most committed to seeing passed, and what impact would they have on your work in Colorado?
Sure. I would say a guaranteed increase in minimum wage is a big one. I think paid family leave. Colorado is quite progressive, and it's exciting to see that we recently incorporated into our medical leave the ability to take that time if you're a domestic violence survivor. The policies that support working mothers are key. I think that helps to make a bit more equal the base level from which people are trying to survive.
I know that when I talked with Ruth, she talked about the Violence Against Women Act and she talked about FOCA. Do you have any thoughts about those?
I think that the movement in general is at an inflection point and trying to understand how we work with the criminal justice system. Organizations are at different places with that. I think the Rose Andom Center is very lucky because we have wonderful relationships with our partners, and we have detectives in our building. And also there are other organizations, other parts of the country where that is not the case at all, and where communities do not want criminal justice interventions as part of the solution for domestic violence. And I think when we look at the time period in which the Violence Against Women Act was first written, it was more tilted towards those types of interventions. Personally, I don't know. I think we need to look at all of the requests that are being made by different communities, by different groups of survivors to understand what is the best way for us to move forward. And I don't think it can look like it did 20 years ago.
It occurs to me that you guys seem to have a model for what you do and collaborations and cooperatives with different parts on that wheel that other communities don't have. So how scalable do you think that is?
I don't know. There's so many unique factors I feel contribute to the positive way in which criminal justice can interact or not interact well with communities. For example, when I lived in Boston, I would say I very seldom worked with the police. Boston has a history of racism that is quite deep. I think here My experience is that it does appear that our police force is more diverse. The folks that are in charge of like the city safety are people of color. Our mayor is Black. I feel like that has a positive impact on policing in the area. And I'm not saying we're perfect, but I think it's had a more positive impact than other parts of the country. So I'm not sure it is scalable. It may be the case that our intervention is not the best intervention for all communities.
So when I was researching your organization for this show, I called and I chatted with this very enthusiastic volunteer. Mm-hmm. And she spoke really highly of the organization, but also notably about the training that she had just completed. She said it was like 20 hours. So what are some of the ways that everyday people can get involved with the work of your center in particular?
We're open to having folks volunteer with us. One of the perks, I guess you could say, of the pandemic is we're very skilled at doing everything online now. Training is all provided virtually. Our navigators all work remotely as well. I think subscribing to our newsletter, which you can do on our website, will give you up-to-date information, whether we have new opportunities for volunteering. We anticipate that once the pandemic is in a better place, we'll be able to do tablings and events again, more community awareness raising. And then there are also probably opportunities to donate if one has the capacity to do that. I think of some of the things we never thought we'd be doing, like we help provide access to cell phones right now, which is life-saving for many people because it's their only way to access resources.
So I'm going to switch a little bit so we can talk about you. How did you come to do this work?
Well, right out of college, I moved to Ithaca, New York. I was looking to do some volunteer work. I had very little knowledge of the work. And basically, I volunteered to work at a shelter, and I painted the shelter and did grounds work. And then I learned how to answer the phone. And then before long, actually wasn't very long at all, I started going on sexual assault nurse examination calls. So the SANEs is what we call them. And I was the medical advocate who did that. And I became the medical advocate for the county. So it was a pretty fast move, I guess you could say. And I felt very dedicated to that work. That work was why I decided to go to divinity school. How did that beginning inform how you progressed in this space? In this space, it's not just domestic violence because it often comes with dealing with emotional, psychological abuse and sex trafficking and sexual assault. So your progression, you feel like is a natural one. And like you said, you took this respite to go to divinity school. How did that inform the work? When I started doing this work, I felt that there was a pretty big, and I don't know if I would agree with this now. I think things have changed a lot, but I felt that there was a pretty significant divide between grassroots feminist organizations and faith communities. I was trying to bring these groups together for the purposes of responding well to survivors. Survivors often go to their minister or someone in their faith community to disclose first. And unfortunately, that's not always the best experience. And then simultaneously, I think the grassroots organizations have been suspicious of religion and the patriarchy and all that for a long time. And so who gets caught in the middle are survivors, whether they identify strongly with their faith or not. I think that intersection I felt needed more work. I would say it was that, along with just the experience of sitting with someone with a SANE, which I think for me felt a lot like chaplaincy, because you're really holding a space for someone. There's not really much more you can do other than being a compassionate presence for them. It was with those two experiences that I decided to go to divinity school, study Buddhism, work on women's advocacy issues, continue to work at the intersections of faith and domestic violence. One of the things that I also want my audience to get is the personal impact that people who are in the caretaking space of this experience. What is the personal impact of this work on you, on your colleagues that you know of? I think that now, because my role is to be the direct supervisor for the providers, I'm more worried about them. And I worry a lot about their sustainability in the field. I worry that they're very isolated, especially when they have to do this work from their homes. I've had the experience of being burnt out a few times and pretty significantly. And I think that those experiences at least have helped me to try different things, like setting better boundaries for myself, not taking on too much, not always trying to overachieve on a day-to-day basis, kind of like keeping it like at 80% so that I can hang in there longer. And I try now to rather imperfectly mirror better behavior for the staff members that report to me. I do think that the people that work for the center do heroic work. And also, I want people to know that you don't have to be a hero to make a difference. Some of the folks that need the most support, it's like there's no one in their lives, no family, friends. And I feel like if we want new and other interventions outside of the system, we need to really build communities of care. And I would say that if someone that you know or someone in your family is a victim of domestic violence, it's important to get them connected with the resources, but also there's so much that people can do by just being a non-judgmental support for the people near them.
What empathy would you invite the general public to employ when thinking about or interacting with people who have experienced domestic violence? Mm-hmm. What are things that they should do that could be helpful? And what are the things that they should refrain from doing that could be unintentionally harmful? The judgment piece is huge for me because I hear it all the time, even in my daily round with my friends. And I'm like, you can't give up eating Oreo cookies. And you're talking about somebody who's been in a complex, intimate relationship with somebody, and why don't they leave and judging them? It's like, it's not that simple. And I think we are seeing more and more in public space, people talking about these issues in more complex ways, right? But I think from the day-to-day, we still have that knee-jerk reactionary way of doing this. So again, what could be more helpful if you're a bystander? This is not really your stuff, but it's somebody you see, it's a colleague, it's somebody that you're concerned about, somebody in your family.
I think if it's someone that you know, I think asking them, what could I do to support you, putting it really there and letting them know if it's not something right now, that whenever they might need it, that they could reach out to you. I think just leaving the door open. I think there's a lot of shame and isolation that comes with the experience of being a survivor and victim of domestic violence. And just simply helping to break that isolation, I think makes a big difference. One of the things that we have started to see is that some of the fatalities that have happened in the last year, the folks that knew the people, the victim, and sometimes if the perpetrator also was killed during the incident, they said that they didn't know that it was happening, which I think speaks to like the hiddenness, like they had no idea it was happening. Also, oftentimes these folks had never connected with resources. So it's saying that it's outside of the scope for many people. One of the ways that I like to look at domestic violence is that for every reason to leave, there's often an equal and more pressing reason to stay. And it's all about how do we help remove the barriers so the person can flee. So versus putting the onus on them of like, why are they staying? Let's look at what do we need to remove for them to feel that they can flee, and to know that like when that happens, that's the most dangerous time for them.
I think in my experience, the judgment is really hard for people to put down. Mm-hmm. What would you say to someone who just finds themselves stuck in the judgment? I feel like in my lived experience, people see more than they're willing to acknowledge. Mm-hmm. So how would we press the person who says, I didn't know, to say, okay, so given that this is the unfortunate, tragic end to this particular incident, here are things that you might keep in mind. I feel like in the human trafficking space, we've been doing a really good job of saying, these are things you should look out for. This is what you should pay attention to. What are those things in the domestic violence space as far as like people saying, well, it was hidden? Because, I do know on some levels that some of this is really, really hidden. But there are personality traits that change. There are all kinds of things that you could kind of see that might be an indication of things that are happening outside of the poster with the black eye kind of experience, right? So how do you, this is two Harvard Divinity School people thinking, like, how do we dismantle the judgment? Like the sort of Black Christian informed me and the Buddhist informed you, by the way, got lots of Buddhist tendencies. I don't know if you see that behind me.
Yeah,
I got like my little Reiki stuff going on. I'm doing Vipassana meditation. Like it's all big stuff in there, even though it's like the Black girl from Baltimore Christian thing. But it's to me, I have my own personal experience of having a huge impasse and having to give up like structural things for me that were huge. Mm-hmm. And I knew the horror of people who were close to me, who saw me in a certain way in the public and all of these things. And then all of a sudden it's like, she's not that person anymore. And the judgment was like intense. I had different skill sets though. So what do you say to normal people who are in the echo chamber, who are constantly provoked by stuff, to just be like, okay, how do you do this? My tactic is, if this were you, how would you want somebody to handle you? To do like the radical empathy where you put yourself literally in the body, not the shoes, because you can kick off the shoes, but in the body of the other person, like knowing that that's somebody's husband or the father of their child or whatever. How would you do that?
It starts by, if you like what you were starting to share about, you start to notice when people near you, when their patterns of behavior are shifting. It could be something as innocuous as they are always canceling appointments, or offhanded comments they might make like, oh, my partner doesn't let me buy groceries there. So anything that you start to notice, there are like, maybe they're not red flags, maybe they're like yellow flags in what your friends and family members might be sharing, and any like off behaviors. I think that that's a good sign, and it may be a good indicator and worthwhile to say to the person, hey, just wanted to check up on you, see how you're doing, kind of just some open questions, so that if they felt comfortable sharing, they would know that you would be that person that they could go to.
How do you suggest to people to get over the unintentional harm? So when you're talking to people in that space and they're like, I didn't see it, and there's a lot of guilt and shame that comes along with that, what are ways in which you empower them to transmute that into something else?
I was thinking sort of to go back on why I think that it's hard for bystanders, right? And hard for family members. And I think some of it can come down to a boundary issue, right? Like it is hard when someone near us is going through something like this. And I think it's natural for people to feel frustrated and upset, so without judging oneself, to just acknowledge that that's the experience that they're having, and to set better boundaries internally. So to say like, okay, my role right now is just to be the compassionate place for this person to go. It's not my job to solve their problem, extract them, build their lives back. That's their work to do. And I'm going to support that work by maintaining my compassion. And when I need to refuel myself, I need to pull back a little bit so that I can go back in a better way. When I think about what's hard for the other people in their lives, it's that. It's like wanting to do too much. And also just reframing that the survivor is the expert in their experience. They've been the ones surviving the situation, and things that might not even seem like obvious abuse tactics to us, the survivor has lived that experience and knows like the tailor-made abuse that they're experiencing. I think that that's a principle too that's helpful for advocates, actually, because advocates can feel defeated. Like, why didn't I fix this, single-handedly fix this situation? And it's like remembering the empowerment, remembering the strength that the survivor has to get through the situation. I think for people that maybe they didn't see it and they're surprised, gosh, I don't know, this may be the divinity school part in me, would be, I would say to try to not blame yourself, like start there and try to forgive yourself for that. And then to try to, when you're ready, maybe not immediately, but when you're ready, find some way that would be meaningful to you to give back.
What is the core value that defines your work in this space?
We should be building policies that impact the most vulnerable first. That's the wisdom I want to carry, versus trying to build an intervention. Let's start with the most vulnerable.
So you have some specific opportunities that you have for volunteers that are accessible to everyday people at Rose Andom. We discussed some of them earlier, and I want you to recap them a little bit. But also, when you think of the landscape across the country and what organizations who are dealing with people who are facing domestic violence, what those needs are, what do you think you want to leave the audience with as far as like, I just heard this podcast, and April is going to make me go to her website and download this form and fill it out and say what the issue is and what's happening on my local level, who are the people I should be looking at, what are the organizations, what are the solutions, and then how am I going to show up and volunteer? That's like my charge every episode. It's like, okay, you heard what happened in Colorado. Do this where you live. Figure it out, go out there and volunteer, and then advocate for policies that will embolden this issue in a better way. What are some of the overarching things that you would say for anybody who wants to have an impact that's positive?
I would say the big thing is to support your local organization. In any state, there's usually a domestic violence coalition. So in Colorado, it's Violence Free Colorado. And there's usually a tool that will tell you based on your city or area what the DV organization or domestic and sexual violence organization is in your area, and then reach out to them to find out how you can be a support to them. That's the best thing for folks to do.
Give them a reasonable kind of understanding of like, okay, I go to, Maryland's DV coalition, right? Okay. And then I click down and it's volunteer opportunities. What am I to expect with those opportunities kind of entail?
For most volunteer opportunities in the domestic and sexual violence space, there's usually a pretty rigorous volunteer training. And that's important because it not only gives folks the background information that they need about the issue, but it also ensures that they are certified as having privilege, confidentiality privilege, which is the key piece of our work. So all of our services and all other organizations would say the same thing, are free and confidential. So survivor confidentiality is critical to us being able to provide services. And when someone has that privilege, then a DV survivor can share their experiences in a safer way.
And then there are other ones where people can possibly donate to shelters. Yeah,
I think so. And I think that no matter what your gifts and talents are, there's some place that you could plug in to support. So let's say maybe your skill is in development area. There are often big fundraising events that need a lot of support, or table captains to bring community people together to raise money. I think if you have acumen for comms, there's like definitely an emerging need for people that are skilled at social media. Nonprofit organizations don't have these huge media budgets. And so we really do rely on skilled people to do all of that. The direct service is a big part. And it's also, I think, a part of our movement. The field has professionalized, but it started out as concerned people, women's groups that built shelters, that answered hotlines. I think that there's a lot of value in continuing to have the culture of volunteerism in our field.
Nicole Castillo, thank you for your work serving those affected by domestic and intimate partner violence in Colorado, and thank you for amplifying America. For the past 2 hours, you've heard survivors, experts, advocates, and philanthropists discuss what they are doing to prevent domestic and intimate partner violence in Colorado and across this nation. Now, I invite you to explore how this issue hits home where you live. Visit the Engage page on amplifyamerica.com and download the Amplify America social card template. Fill it out and share what meaningful actions you will engage to combat this issue in your community. And tell me about it by posting on social media using the hashtags Amplify America, Amplify Action, and Amplifier. Together, let's amplify America. Amplify America's sound engineer is Alexander Wierczewski, and our production intern is Kaya Karibi-White. Special thanks to Carl Jenkins for gifting production support. Thanks for listening.